All right. So welcome. I think I'll go ahead and get started. My name is Thiemann. I'm the Distilled Spirits Program Manager for TTB'S Regulations and Rulings Division. I'm excited to be here talking about a big project I've been working on for a number of years now. We typically, when we have big rulemaking projects, come out and go to lots of conferences and give overviews of them, and we got a little off track because of the government shutdown and being closed for so long. So this is actually our first opportunity on this project to get out and talk to people directly, kind of give an overview of how the project came to be, what's in it, and how you guys can be helpful in the comment period as we're going forward. Yeah, is that hard to hear me? No worries, thanks. Yeah, let me know if you can't hear me in the future. A little bit about myself. I've been with TTB a little bit over 10 years now. I've worked on distilled spirits primarily my entire time at TTB, although I've done a little bit of work on everything: wine, beer, tobacco, firearms tax. And so I was selected with my colleague, who's our wine program manager, to head up this labeling modernization project a few years ago. And like I said, it's been a huge undertaking, and we're excited that it's finally published for comment. Just a little disclaimer, this isn't setting up any new regulations here, any new policies or procedures, so if you have questions about what the regulations say, see them themselves and not what I'm saying here. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about our labeling initiatives in general, how this project fits into our overall strategic goal of improving our labeling services. I'm going to talk about the regulations proposal itself and how we came up with some of the things that you'll see in the regulations, some of the ideas, putting everything together. I'll talk about some of the highlights specific for distilled spirits for your guys' interest. And then I'm going to talk about how to provide comments and what kinds of comments are useful to us. Just a little disclaimer, because this isn't an official public hearing, I can't accept comments on the floor like this. So if you obviously anyone's welcome to ask questions they want and say whatever they want, but any official comments that you want to provide to the rulemaking themselves, make sure you do that in writing, and I'll talk about that later, as opposed to just raising your hand and doing it now, because I can't take those into account for making policy. So as I said, this big rulemaking project is part of TTB's strategic goal for facilitating commerce and with a labeling program focused on service and market compliance. So over the past number of years, as you know, our staff has stayed about stable, and the craft distilling and actually all of our alcohol beverage industries have grown significantly. So a number of years ago, you may recall that labels and formulas and permits were taking way too long to be approved. We understand that that's not good for anybody. You guys want to get new products to market, and when there's long delays in getting formulas approved and then labels approved, it slows everything down, and it's not good for us either. We want you guys to be in business, bringing new products to market, and so we started to come up with some ways that we can make improvements to that. And as you already know, even before these regulations have come into play, we've completely had a turnaround with processing times for formulas and labels. We're working on permits now. So some of the things that we've done in this initiative: we eliminated the need for some of the formulas. You'll see there's a number of products now that used to require formula approval that now can be brought right to the label process without needing to get a formula. We expanded the list of changes that can be made to labels without needing to get a new certificate of label approval, again, speeding your ability to bring things to market if you're just making minor changes to your labels. We've updated our systems, COLAs Online and Formulas Online, to provide more information as you're submitting the applications so that they can be approved the first time. And we've increased guidance, and we've also added staff. So I think now, Stephen, our formulas are down to about 2 days turnaround, 5 days, and labels around 15, and it's been great. So how does this fit into this? One of the things, again, as I said, our workload has just grown so significantly that we have a stable staff and trying to figure out ways to keep our processing times down. And we looked at our regulations and we said many of the regulations with regard to labeling haven't been updated since the end of Prohibition when they were written. And our last even significant overhaul to them, which wasn't even that significant, was in the 1960s. So we still see that for every label that's submitted, a label application, we have about, I think, around 44% needs correction rate. And we said, how can we expect industry members to submit their label applications correctly the first time if the regulations aren't even very easy to understand? So we need to improve the regulations. We want to make them simplified and clearer where we can. incorporate guidance and current policies, and reduce the burden on industry where possible. So how did we do this? So about 6 years ago, I set up work groups with people from basically every part of TTB. Field staff, our labeling and formulation staff, auditors, investigators, and we sat down and went through all of the current regulations, parts 4, 5, and 7, really in detail to see what makes sense, what kind of technological changes have happened, what kind of changes in consumer tastes have happened, and how can we improve these to make them readable. We reviewed all the public guidance. So as you know, there's industry circulars out there, there's rulings, there's the beverage alcohol manual that all have kind of pieces of policy, even frequently asked questions on our website, that to know what all the requirements are, you have to look in many different places. So we wanted to incorporate those into the regulations. On top of that, we have sort of unwritten policies that have come into play over the years that we sort of expect people to comply with, or at the very least, we use those policies when we're doing our review of labels and formulas, but they've not been published anywhere. So we want to put those all into the regulations so it's kind of a one-stop shop to find out all the rules. As I said, we explored needed updates and changes, just taking into account changes in tastes. And then we started the drafting and review process. So to tell you a little bit about how that works, as a team, we drafted the regulations, and then it has to go through many levels of review before it can be published. So I would say the actual drafting of the whole thing probably finished about several years ago, makes its way through legal review and then up to the main Treasury Department until we finally have authorization to publish it. So as you know, last November 26th, we did publish the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking on it's published as TTB Notice 176. It's available on regulations.gov, which is also where you make comment. Yesterday, we published an extension of the comment period, so you have another 90 days. The comment period now plans to close on June 26, 2019. As printed, it's about 125 pages, but the original Microsoft Word document that I printed out before it was published is about 650 pages, so it's very lengthy. But that includes a full recodification of parts 4, 5, and 7, so that's malt beverages, wine, and distilled spirits. One of the things it also does is it kind of separates and condenses all of the advertising regulations into a new part 14. Most of the advertising regulations are pretty uniform for wine, distilled spirits, and malt beverages, so rather than having them repeated 3 places, put them all together in a part 14 so you can find them all. Okay, so I'm going to go through some of the highlights of what we did in this rulemaking document. So as I said, a lot of what we did was clarifying changes to make things easier to find, easier to understand. One of the things that I think is kind of interesting is now that we've seen so many industry members that are producing products in more than one category, brewers that also want to start distilling and so forth. We try to make consistency between parts 4, 5, and 7 with regard to the organization. So if the name and address section for spirits is in 5.40, it would also be in 4.40 for wine and 7.40 for malt beverages. So it's always easy to find things that you're looking for. We had a lot of cross-references and examples to increase usability. And like I said, we incorporated policies and public guidance. And here are some examples of some of these. I know the last one on the list, I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail because that's raised a lot of questions. But we added things like aggregate packaging, which is when you make a standard of fill by smaller bottles that all add up to a certain standard of fill. So like a 1 liter that might actually have 10 100 milliliter bottles inside of it. That's kind of been an unwritten policy that ALFD has followed, and so we put those rules in the regulations. Cross-references to the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So basically, if something doesn't comply with any of the FDA regulations, then we deem it to be mislabeled under our regulations as well. We provide details about how to label your products if it's under a certificate of exemption and it's only going to be sold within a particular state. We provided that the use of flags is only prohibited if used in a misleading way. The current regulations actually say that the use of flags or other government symbols is prohibited. We've kind of, as an unwritten policy, we've started to allow the use of flags as long as it's not implying that it's a government-produced product or has some kind of special government certification. But we want people to be able to be patriotic on their labels if they choose to. Again, a long-standing rule that products under 0.5 ABV are not distilled spirits under the FAA Act. So that's been something that's been in place but hasn't really been published anywhere. And then proposing a definition of the term oak barrel. And I can talk a little bit more about this. So as many of you know, and it's provided the bulk of the comments so far as what we've seen on this rulemaking document, in the proposed rules, we set forth a definition that would define oak barrel as generally a traditional cylindrical shaped barrel of approximately 50 gallons. And we actually have another rulemaking project on this issue, so I can talk a little bit more in detail because we have published in our what's called the Unified Agenda a notice that we're going to be asking for comment on this particular issue. So in doing research on oak barrels, we've kind of seen that the last time the agency looked into proposing a size, they were going to say, should we say it has to be less than 1,000 gallons or something like that? And this was in the 1960s. At the time, most of the barrels used were traditional oak barrels, about 53 gallons. And they decided not to put something in the regulations, but leave it up to, as long as the product has the taste, characteristics, and aroma generally attributed to whiskey, you can use that kind of barrel. But over the years, we've gotten much more specific questions through private letter rulings asking, what is a barrel for the purpose of aging bourbon whiskey? And so our predecessor agency, going back decades, ATF, and now TTB, we've consistently kind of given that definition, that it's a traditional oak barrel, approximately 50 gallons, but it's never been published anywhere. And so one of the interesting things when you're putting together regulatory proposals is you could either just ask a question or you can put something out there. And so we put this proposal in the rulemaking document knowing that it would generate comment, but we also have this separate rulemaking project. So we're planning to publish what's called an advanced notice of proposed rulemaking, where we don't propose anything, but we ask lots of questions about what a barrel should be for bourbon. Does it have to all be oak? Could it be metal and oak? Could it be cubes? Things like that. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of comfort that I know that this has caused so much consternation in the comments, and still comment on this big rulemaking project on this issue, but we are planning to have another rulemaking on oak barrels particularly. So please be on the lookout for that and provide comments on what you really think makes sense for aging bourbon whiskeys and other products that require barrels. I think in the long run, what we want is to make sure that if someone sees something that's called a bourbon whiskey on the label, or if it's a brandy and they say it's aged 4 years, the consumer is actually getting what they expect. So if it ends up the industry thinks that 20-gallon barrels are fine and consumers are fine with that, let us know in the comments. Liberalizing changes. So we tried to do as many things as we could in the regulations to liberalize the rules about how to label products. We provide greater flexibility in placing of mandatory information. So we're actually proposing to eliminate the concept of the brand label for distilled spirits, which kind of provides more flexibility of how you can design your bottles and labels. Eliminating the pre-approval lab testing for products containing wormwood. So currently anything that contains wormwood has to go through a lab approval process before you can even get to the COLA process. So we're eliminating that. I also don't have it on this list, but we set forth a standard of identity for absinthe. So rather than absinthe being a specialty product, it would actually have some standards behind it. Similarly, we provide standards for white whiskey and unaged whiskey. As you know, whiskey currently has to be aged in a barrel, although there's no time minimum. So, I know some people who want to make like a white dog product, they'll put it in the barrel for 1 minute or 1 day, and we're setting forth new standards. So you could label something as white whiskey, you could age it if you wanted, or you could just fully unage it and call it an unaged whiskey. We set forth a class called agave spirits. As you know, right now there's a standard of identity for tequila in the regulations. Tequila has to come from Mexico. Mezcal is also a product that's recognized under NAFTA and the new U.S.-Mexico trade agreement. But there's not really any standards for someone who wants to make agave spirits in the United States. So we're kind of setting forth a new class called agave spirits, and it would have types tequila and mezcal, but that way U.S. producers could also make a similar kind of product and call it agave spirits on the label. Right now, again, that would just be a distilled spirit specialty product. This might be an interesting one for you guys. We're proposing to expand the alcohol content tolerance for distilled spirits. So as you know, right now, the regulations only provide for a drop in alcohol content, 2 different numbers based on whether it is a high solids content or a small bottle. The expanded alcohol tolerance in this regulation would allow for a variance of plus or minus 0.3% ABV. So that actually provides a little more flexibility in proofing your products. I know when we pull products for our alcohol beverage sampling program, being overproof is one of the most significant errors that we see. Sometimes it's by a tiny amount, so we think this would just make things easier for everybody. And one other thing, we're allowing more options for the advertiser's contact information on advertisements. Right now it says name and address. We're providing some flexibility there. So we have a few things that we've listed as what we've called potentially restrictive changes. In this whole project, we were not intending to require large-scale relabeling. Most of these things would provide new options, some new standards, but it was not ever our intent that we would ask everyone to come in and get new labels after these regulations come into place. But we do have a few changes that we think might require some people to change their labels. We do specifically request comment on that issue. So if someone looks at this and says, oh, this is going to create huge problems or tons of people are going to have to change their labels for XYZ issue, provide that kind of comment as well. That's useful information to us. We set forth some new standards for statements of composition, having to do with, for distilled spirits, one of the things we say is that the statement of composition should list the spirits and wines in order of predominance, which kind of mirrors food labels, so that if you're making something that has gin and vodka and wine, and it's actually 90% wine, the wine should come first in the statement of composition. We think that just provides more transparency to consumers. The other thing that's set forth there would provide that if people are mixing products together in an intermediate, right now that can be labeled as natural flavors on the label. It would say that the statement of composition should actually be put together based on the actual components that are in the bottle, not just whether they've been mixed together first. So that again would provide transparency and clarity to consumers so that they actually know what's in the bottle that they're buying. Some other things, we say we're going to prohibit labeling that provides a misleading impression that the product is a different commodity. So already things that are misleading are there, but we want to make it very clear that if you have a distilled spirit and you're trying to make it look like a particular kind of wine, that maybe a particular grape varietal that's hot right now, it should not mislead consumers so that they think they're buying that wine. We're also providing standards for distillation claims, and this is another one that I'm actually interested to hear people's comments on. We have lots of labels that say things like triple distilled, 10 times distilled, and the regulations currently don't really provide what that means. They say you can use these distillation claims on label as long as they're truthful. So the standard that we set forth in this rulemaking document is that a distillation would be either a run through a pot still or a single column of a column still. So if your column still has 15 plates, you can't say it's 15 times distilled. That would be 1 time distilled. But please, if anyone has thoughts on that's one that we're particularly interested in comments on. What makes sense to say if you're calling something triple distilled? State of distillation is one that we've seen some issues with over the past few years in our labeling program. As you know, many people source whiskeys from other states, and their state of distillation is required if the state in which the product was distilled is different than that on the address. We're just tightening this up a little bit so that if you want to use the name and address as the state of distillation claim, it actually would have to say distilled by. So what that means is you have 3 options for putting your state of distillation. Let's say you buy whiskey in Indiana and bottle it in Ohio. You could call it Indiana Straight Bourbon Whiskey. That would suffice as the class and type, and that gives the name right there that it's Indiana whiskey. You could have a statement somewhere on the label saying distilled in Indiana. And then in this case, this wouldn't work, but if it was the same state, so if it was distilled in Indiana and bottled in Indiana, you could just say bottled by Chris's Distillery in Evansville, Indiana. We think that that's not very clear to consumers, and also we want to make sure that industry members know that if they're using that as the state of distillation statement, they actually mean that that's where it was distilled. So we were just saying you would have to use the word distilled by in that term to, again, make sure that consumers know that if it's distilled in a particular state, they know that what they're getting. We are proposing to eliminate the category of recognized cocktails and require a full statement of composition for cocktails rather than an abbreviated one. Part of this is that the number of cocktails out there has just grown exponentially. And we don't think it really provides a lot of information to consumers if you label your product as pink squirrel and the name of the spirit without actually telling them what it is. So this isn't a very significant change, but it kind of takes us out of the job of being the cocktail police. So Bloody Mary right now, it could just say with vodka, you know, a new statement of composition might be something like vodka with natural flavors, or you could say vodka with tomato and whatever else is in it if you chose to. Again, just a slight tightening up. And then one last one on this list, we're saying that if whiskey meets a standard of identity for one of the types, it should actually be labeled with that type as opposed to just using the class whiskey. The regulations already actually say something like that. They say if a product, any distilled spirits meets a standard of identity, then the label shall state that standard of identity as the class and type designation. But over the years, it's kind of become a policy that if someone just wants to label it as whiskey, they can. We do carve out an exception here for Tennessee whiskey because Tennessee whiskey might meet other type designations and is well known in international agreements. But if someone's making a blended whiskey or a spirit whiskey or a light whiskey, we think they actually should use that class and type on the label. So those are just some of the highlights. How to make comments on the document. Regulations.gov is probably the easiest way. You can go right on the web and provide comments there. You can use mail or hand delivery to us. So what are useful types of comments? One thing that I always say when I'm talking about rulemaking is we really do take the comments seriously. We like to come out to these kinds of events and talk to distillers and wineries and breweries and kind of keep an eye on what's going on, but we don't always know exactly what makes the most sense for industry members. So we take the comments that come in for any rulemaking project very seriously. They're not just because we have to take them. We really do look at them. What I find to be particularly useful is if someone doesn't like a particular section of regulation, they say, you know, why they don't like that section of regulation and provide something that they think works better. Obviously, people can submit a comment that just says, oh, I don't like what's in XYZ, but then I'm kind of left wondering, well, what would work better? What would they like instead? So the most useful comments actually maybe provide alternatives or reasons why they think something won't work or something else will work. And I find this to be really helpful as we're taking next steps. And what are next steps? So after the comment period closes at the end of June, we'll definitely take time to review the comments. I just looked this morning, we have already 115 comments. I predict by June we'll have many more than that. So it'll take some time to review those comments and then figure out next steps. So I say potential next rulemaking documents on there because depending on what the comments reveal, we might take different kinds of steps. It might make sense for us to move right to a final rule and publish, you know, the final rules. They'll put the regulations in place. Sometimes we'll say, okay, we've had a lot of comments on these issues. We'd like to actually put out a second notice of proposed rulemaking with some changes so that people can see the way we're thinking and provide further comments on whether that makes sense. We also could do final rules in particular areas and take more time to take comments on other areas. So right now, because this is probably the biggest rulemaking project that our agency has undertaken, we don't know exactly what the next steps are going to be after the comment period ends. But when we do have a final rule come out, we propose that we'd have a 3-year compliance date. So experience has shown that within 3 years, almost the vast majority of labels have been changed anyway for artistic reasons or just marketing reasons. So we think if anyone wants to make changes or are required to make changes to their labels, we would give a 3-year compliance date to make those changes. Again, something else that people can comment on if they have any issues with that. So on that note, that's the end of my prepared remarks. I'm happy to take questions. If there's any that I can't answer, I'll just say I can't answer them and take them into consideration, but feel free. Yes.
In the proposed CFR right now, the classification or the category of American single malt whiskey is not included, but there is a movement to try to include it. Can you comment on the likelihood of that actually happening, like being included as a category?
I can't comment on the likelihood because I don't know. I can tell you that we did receive a petition to make American single malt whiskey a class, or I guess it would be a type in the regulations. And I think people can probably figure out on their own by the timing that petition was received after the drafting on this document was done. So The fact that that document is not accounted for in this rulemaking doesn't necessarily have any reflection on whether or not American single malt whiskey might be acceptable. So that's a separate rulemaking in review. People are certainly welcome to comment on that issue for this rulemaking as well. We would make determinations. And that is something that's, because we've received a petition on it, and if we receive comments on it to this rulemaking, I think legally we might be able to put it in a final rule. We might have to do a separate notice and put it through, but with regard to whether or not, I think it's still in review. Yes?
You mentioned listing the state where the product is distilled. If you had a joint venture with multiple entities from different states, bring the product together, blend together, would you have to include every one of those states on that label?
So depending on the class and type, there are a few types of whiskey that don't require state labeling, but assuming it's one that does require it, so like a bourbon whiskey or something like that, yeah, you would list all the states. And you could do that just, as a little statement anywhere on your label, distilled in, whatever states it was distilled in. And that's under the, sorry? It actually can be on any label. It can be on the front or back label. Any other questions? Yes.
With proofing error, the adjustment in what you're taking for proofing error, or is there any thought process behind improving, going from any instrument that can read up to the 5th decimal place to 4th decimal place? Is because I think everybody knows that hydrometers are not very accurate in making something that we can actually use to do it without spending $20,000.
Yeah, I think that was probably outside the scope of this rulemaking because this is mostly focusing on labeling, although there are tax implications with proofing as well. I think that would have to be a separate request. But feel free to, if this is a large industry problem, I've certainly heard this issue before. That's something that could be petitioned for or, request. I know there are some pieces of equipment that our laboratory lists online as alternatives. I'm not sure how expensive they are. I think they're expensive. Yes.
Currently, a behind-the-scenes definition for distillation. Address that late versus single pass.
I think not really, but I think that's why we tried to come up with one in this rulemaking document. I think if we saw a label that said distilled 100 times, we might question it and say, okay, what do you actually mean by this? And I would think if they said, well, I have 2 columns, each with 50 plates or whatever number, we might question that. But if someone submits a label that says distilled 3 times, I think right now we're going to take them at face value. Yes?
I believe I heard you mention that there is a possibility of relabeling for the masses on certain things. Can you talk specifically on what would be those requirements for the relabeling and what these rule changes, and briefly touch on them?
Yeah, these are the ones. I mean, our hope is that there wouldn't be massive relabeling. We're hoping that there might be a few products that are affected by these, but our intention was not that everyone would have to change their labels. So these are the significant ones that I thought applied to distilled spirits. The list in the regulations is a little bit longer because there are a few for wine and malt beverages as well. But yeah, our hope is not that everyone would have to change their labels, that we would add some.
You mentioned there's a few though.
Yeah, these. So for
one that could potentially be an issue that we have to relabel.
Yeah, so for example, the statement of composition rules. Let's say you're making a Long Island iced tea and you say, you want to emphasize certain products, vodka, gin, whatever, but maybe the first ones you have, it's just 1% and it's bulk neutral spirits or something. So if we do implement the change that says that the statement of composition has to be in order of predominance, that might require a label change. But like I said, I don't think it would be a lot of labels. I think our intention, at least, is that it would be a small number. And if it does look like some of these would create huge number of label changes, please comment on that. Yes?
Kind of regarding the misleading impression, what is joking, when it's not joking. Large manufacturer in my state, which quote unnamed, has a misleading or a statement on his bottle of handmade. How do you go back and judge that that's a handmade product?
I don't think I am familiar enough with the thinking behind that to comment on it. I don't know if any of my colleagues have anything they want to add on that issue. Oh, Sarah, did you have, so Sarah's one of our labeling specialists. Yeah, I think one thing that I didn't mention when I was saying how to comment and what to comment, not only can you comment on the specific proposals in this document, but this is maybe your once-in-a-lifetime chance to have a full recodification of all the labeling regulations, and so you are welcome to provide comments on other things that you think should be changed or added or implemented into the regulations. So if there are terms like handmade or other terms that you think should be defined or something should be done about, those are also comments that we would appreciate. Yes?
On that same vein, if there is a label that I have an issue with that doesn't make sense or I feel is misleading, would the best way to do that is to take a picture of it, send it to you, and highlight, I feel that this statement is misleading because of this. Is that the best way to comment on that? Or? Yeah,
I mean, obviously we have the public COLA registry, so you don't even have to take a picture if you can pull the COLA from the public COLA registry. But yeah, you would submit that to...
Is that the best way, to very ABC on the comments, this is exactly what I have?
Yeah. Are you talking about in response to this rulemaking document, or are you talking about if you want to provide a complaint about it?
Not a complaint, but saying the statement of origin, and having statement of origin saying that, well, I'm an Indiana bottler buying Indiana product, so I'm just going to give my address. That's to say, lovingly bottled by.
Right.
I say that that's a misleading statement. Is that is going this label saying bottled by, and just that's the statement of origin.
Yeah, if you want to provide something like that as a comment to the rulemaking and say, hey, we're seeing these out in the market, we think this is misleading, here are some examples, here's a recommendation. Where I was going with complaints is you also can submit particular complaints, and we get those all the time, actually. We usually can't get back to the complainant about what kind of action we take, but we look into those and we'll take action if appropriate. In your specific example, though, where lovingly bottled in Indiana, that would be one that was addressed by the change that we'd make. Then they would have to say distilled in Indiana if it really is. Yes?
Well, just to kind of to clarify what the proposed language for that is, you gave those three examples of three different options you can put, but if you're sourcing spirit in the same state, you're bottling it, if you are then allowed to say distilled by Joe's Distillery, even though Joe's Distillery is sourcing that spirit from someone else, how can you differentiate between someone who's actually distilling it versus someone that's sourcing it? I guess I wasn't really clear on that.
Yeah, I didn't make that clear, but you're right. You could only say it's distilled by if you distilled it. Yeah, someone who purchases it cannot say distilled by.
You don't have to state that it's distilled by.
You don't have to use the word distilled by. You could choose to use one of the other options, just calling it, for example, Indiana Straight Bourbon Whiskey, or you could just say distilled in Indiana anywhere on the label as a separate statement.
But you would need that separate statement.
Yes. Yes.
Don't you notice, I thought the proposed rule is if you're the second distiller to provide the source juice, that you could say rectified by, you're redistilling.
Yeah, you could certainly use the other terms, and even today, you could say other things, bottled by, of course, rectified by, something like that. But then, if you did that, it wouldn't necessarily suffice as the state of distillation statement. So you might still need a separate state of distillation statement. That's right. Was there another question over in the back? Oh, okay. All right, any other questions? All right, well, we look forward to hearing your comments and thoughts on this rulemaking, and please feel free to reach out to me. Specific questions to come to me, my email's there. Also, just more general regulatory questions, feel free to send to regulations@ttb.gov. And thank you for your time.